America owes more than $33 trillion today, more than the total value of its entire economy. Debt is often painted as a weakness, but in the story of the United States, it became a defining tool of power. From the Revolutionary War to the 21st century, borrowing has shaped the nation's growth, its global influence, and its rise to superpower status. Debt financed wars, infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation, creating leverage that competitors lacked. It created a system where financial credibility, rather than mere resources, became a source of strength. The story begins in 1776, when the colonies declared independence. The Revolutionary War required massive funding, yet the new government lacked gold reserves or significant tax revenue. Instead, leaders like Alexander Hamilton embraced debt as a strategic tool. War bonds were issued, funded by domestic investors and foreign creditors in Europe. These debts were not just liabilities, they were promises backed by future growth. They tied domestic elites to the success of the new republic and signaled to the world that America was a serious economic actor. By the early 19th century, debt remained central to national development. Internal improvements, roads, canals, bridges, were financed with borrowed money. The Erie Canal, a marvel of engineering, was built through state and federal loans. Railroads and ports expanded using credit, connecting regional economies and enabling commerce on an unprecedented scale. Debt allowed the United States to turn scarcity into infrastructure, building wealth before it existed in tangible form. Wars continued to redefine America's debt landscape. The Civil War required vast borrowing, issuing treasury bonds purchased by citizens, banks, and foreign investors. Northern and Southern economies relied on credit, though for very different purposes. The North used debt to finance industry and railroads, creating permanent financial infrastructure. The South relied on debt to sustain plantations and purchase arms, tying credit directly to slavery and exports. In both cases, the national economy evolved around the management, circulation, and strategic use of debt. Industrialization and urbanization of the late 19th century relied heavily on debt. Factories, steel mills, and railroads expanded through credit markets, often with government support or guarantees. American banks became skilled at mobilizing domestic savings into investments that financed growth. Corporations issued bonds, cities borrowed to improve public services, and entrepreneurs leveraged credit to innovate. Debt became a tool not of weakness, but of expansion. It allowed the nation to outpace competitors who relied solely on accumulated capital. The 20th century accelerated this trend. World War I plunged the U.S. into international lending, providing credit to allies while creating new global financial networks. By the 1920s, America was both debtor and creditor, exporting loans abroad while borrowing for domestic infrastructure. And the Great Depression tested the limits of debt, but it also demonstrated its flexibility. The federal government increased borrowing to finance relief programs, public works, and stabilization efforts. Debt became a mechanism for economic intervention, not just a burden. World War II transformed debt into a geopolitical tool. The U.S. spent billions financing the war effort, mobilizing both domestic and international capital. Treasury bonds were sold to ordinary citizens, creating a national stake in victory. Industrial production surged, powered by borrowed money that enabled factories to expand and supply armies at home and abroad. Post-war, the debt-financed victory allowed the United States to dominate global trade, finance, and production. War bonds, government borrowing, and the expansion of the Federal Reserve System created a financial ecosystem that supported American global influence. The post-war era reinforced the power of debt. The United States held unparalleled reserves, issued the world's primary reserve currency, and extended credit to rebuild Europe and Asia. Programs like the Marshall Plan used U.S. borrowing and surplus production to reshape the global economy, tying allies to American markets and currency. Debt became a mechanism of influence. Lending nations could dictate terms, shape policy, and secure markets without direct conflict. Domestic borrowing also fueled prosperity. The GI Bill, interstate highways, and public investments in energy and education were financed through debt. Consumer credit expanded, enabling ordinary Americans to buy homes, cars, and appliances, driving aggregate demand and industrial output. Debt was democratized, linking citizens' consumption and investment to national growth. The government leveraged its borrowing capacity to create a multiplier effect, expanding wealth, productivity, and global economic influence simultaneously. Financial institutions evolved alongside this system. Banks, investment firms, and central authorities learned to manage risk at unprecedented scale. Bond markets grew deeper and more liquid, allowing states and corporations to borrow efficiently. The United States became a hub of capital accumulation, lending abroad while maintaining domestic growth. Credit ratings, regulatory oversight, and monetary policy all developed as mechanisms to maintain confidence, proving that strategic debt could generate systemic power rather than instability. During the Cold War, debt underpinned strategic dominance. Military spending, space programs, and technological innovation relied on borrowed capital. The government issued bonds to fund nuclear arsenals, satellites, and research programs. American borrowing signaled stability to the world and backed a currency increasingly accepted in global trade. Allies and adversaries alike observed that a nation capable of mobilizing vast credit could project power far beyond its borders. Debt became a silent instrument of national strategy. Even financial crises reinforced this framework: the 1970s oil shocks, the 1980s debt crises in Latin America, and the 2008 financial collapse all demonstrated the resilience of U.S. credit markets. Investors continued to trust Treasury securities, and the dollar remained the backbone of international finance. By the 21st century, debt had become central to America's global influence. Trillions are borrowed annually, but this borrowing underwrites the military, federal programs, and international engagement. The United States maintains the world's dominant reserve currency, giving it leverage to sanction, incentivize, and stabilize across borders. Federal borrowing allows domestic growth, global projection, and the management of crises that would cripple other nations. Debt shapes modern American influence in subtle ways. Federal obligations affect interest rates worldwide, shape currency markets, and underpin global liquidity. Central banks hold U.S. debt as reserves, tying financial stability to American fiscal policy. Borrowing powers give the nation strategic flexibility in conflicts, development aid, and international agreements. Even when challenged by deficits, the credibility of U.S. debt allows action that other nations cannot replicate. Understanding America's rise requires understanding debt as an instrument of power. Debt enabled Americans to convert future productivity into present capacity, creating leverage that underpinned economic, military, and technological dominance.